The year was 1979, and Captain James Sullivan was supposed to be home for Christmas. His wife had already wrapped the presents, his 2 young daughters had circled the date on the calendar in red marker, and the turkey was ordered from the butcher down the street in their quiet Virginia suburb. But on December 18th, Jim received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was calm, direct, and offered no room for questions. He had 72 hours to report to a classified location. No explanations, no goodbyes that made sense. He told his wife he had an unexpected training exercise. She knew better than to ask more. Jim wasn't your typical military officer. He had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner who believed in hard work, faith, and keeping your word. Jim joined the army right out of high school, drawn by a sense of duty that his father had instilled in him since childhood. He climbed the ranks not through politics or connections, but through sheer competence and an unshakable calm under pressure. By 1979, he was a decorated helicopter pilot with 2 tours in Vietnam under his belt and a reputation for getting his crew home alive no matter what. But nothing in his 15 years of service had prepared him for what was about to happen. When Jim arrived at the undisclosed airbase, he found himself among a group of men who looked just as confused as he felt. There were pilots, mechanics, special operations soldiers, and intelligence officers, all hand-picked from different branches of the military. Nobody knew why they were there. The briefing room was sterile, the kind of place where secrets went to live and die. A senior official walked in, and the room fell silent. What he said next sounded like something out of a spy novel. 52 Americans were being held hostage in Iran. The embassy in Tehran had been overrun by revolutionaries 2 months earlier, and diplomatic efforts had gone nowhere. The country was watching, waiting, and growing angrier by the day. The United States needed to act, and it needed to act soon. The official laid out the plan. It was called Operation Eagle Claw, and it was as ambitious as it was dangerous. A team of elite soldiers would fly into Iran under cover of darkness, land at a remote desert staging area, then move into Tehran to rescue the hostages. Everything had to go perfectly. Timing, weather, equipment, secrecy. One mistake, and it would all fall apart. Jim felt his stomach tighten as the details unfolded. This wasn't just another mission. This was the kind of operation that could define a presidency or destroy it. And he was going to be right in the middle of it. Training began immediately, and it was unlike anything Jim had experienced before. The team worked in complete isolation, cut off from their families and the outside world. They practiced nighttime desert landings, simulated hostage extractions, and rehearsed emergency scenarios until every movement became muscle memory. The pressure was immense. Everyone knew what was at stake. The hostages had been paraded on television, blindfolded and humiliated, while angry crowds chanted outside the embassy gates. America felt powerless, and this mission was supposed to change that. Jim was assigned to pilot one of the helicopters that would carry the rescue team into Iran. The aircraft they were using were RH-53D Sea Stallions, massive machines designed for Navy operations but hastily adapted for this desert mission. Jim spent hours studying the flight path, memorizing every landmark, every potential hazard. The route would take them deep into Iranian territory, flying low to avoid radar detection. There would be no lights, no radio chatter, no room for error. If something went wrong, they would be on their own, hundreds of miles from safety in a country that wanted them dead. As the days passed, Jim started to notice cracks in the plan. The helicopters were old and prone to mechanical issues. The desert environment was harsh and unpredictable, and the operational security, while tight, felt fragile. Too many moving parts, too many things that could go wrong. But orders were orders, and Jim trusted the men he was flying with. They were the best America had to offer, and if anyone could pull this off, it was them. Still, As the mission date approached, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. On April 24, 1980, the mission launched. Jim and his crew took off from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz in the middle of the night, their helicopter loaded with fuel and supplies. The flight toward Iran was tense and silent. Jim kept his eyes on the instruments, his hands steady on the controls. Below them, the dark waters of the Gulf gave way to the Iranian coastline, then to endless stretches of desert. The plan called for them to reach a location known as Desert One, a remote airstrip where they would refuel and link up with the ground team before pushing on to Tehran. But the desert had other plans. Almost immediately, they ran into a massive dust storm, the kind that turns the sky into a wall of sand and makes visibility nearly zero. Jim had flown through bad weather before, but this was different. The helicopter shook and rattled, the instruments flickered, and the sand seemed to seep into every crevice of the machine. He could barely see the other helicopters in the formation. Radio silence meant he couldn't call for help or reassurance. All he could do was keep flying, trust his instincts, and hope they made it through. When Jim finally broke through the storm and approached Desert One, relief washed over him. He could see the dim outlines of the other aircraft on the ground, the C-130 transport planes that had arrived earlier to set up the refueling station. But as he brought his helicopter down, he realized something was wrong. One of the helicopters in his group had turned back due to mechanical failure. Another had developed a hydraulic problem and was barely functional. The mission required a minimum of 6 operational helicopters to proceed. They had exactly 6. There was no margin for error left. Jim shut down his engines and climbed out into the cold desert night. The scene around him was controlled chaos. Pilots and crew members were scrambling to assess the damage. Mechanics were trying to fix the failing helicopter, and the mission commanders were huddled in intense discussion. The air was thick with tension. Everyone knew what was at stake, and everyone could feel the mission slipping away. Jim stood by his helicopter, watching the other crews work, feeling helpless. He had done his part. He had gotten his bird to Desert One. But now the fate of the mission and the hostages rested on decisions being made by people he couldn't see. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the helicopters that had been deemed operational suddenly developed a critical failure. The hydraulic system was completely shot. There was no way to fix it in the field and no way to continue the mission with only 5 helicopters. The mission commander made the call. Operation Eagle Claw was aborted. They were pulling out. Jim felt a mix of relief and crushing disappointment. Relief that he wouldn't have to fly deeper into hostile territory with failing equipment. Disappointment that 52 Americans would wake up tomorrow still in captivity, still waiting for a rescue that had just fallen apart in the desert. The order was given to pack up and leave. Jim and his crew began the process of preparing their helicopter for the flight back to the carrier. But in the darkness and confusion, disaster struck. One of the helicopters, trying to reposition for takeoff, collided with a C-130 transport plane. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Fuel ignited, flames erupted into the night sky, and the desert lit up like daylight. Jim watched in horror as men ran from the inferno, some on fire, others trying desperately to pull their comrades to safety. The explosion was so intense that ammunition inside the aircraft began cooking off, sending rounds flying in every direction. Jim and the other pilots were ordered to abandon their helicopters immediately and board the remaining C-130s. There was no time to think, no time to process what had just happened. 8 men were dead, their bodies consumed by the flames. The mission had gone from aborted to catastrophic in a matter of seconds. Jim ran toward the transport plane, the heat from the fire scorching his back, the sound of explosions ringing in his ears. He climbed aboard, and the plane took off into the darkness, leaving behind the burning wreckage, the dead, and any hope of secrecy. The flight back was silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody made eye contact. Jim sat in the cargo hold of the C-130, his mind replaying the events over and over. The dust storm, the mechanical failures, the collision, the fire. He thought about the men who didn't make it out, men he had trained with, flown with, trusted with his life. He thought about the hostages still trapped in Tehran, who would now face even harsher conditions because of the failed rescue attempt. And he thought about what would happen when the world found out. When they landed back at the carrier, Jim was immediately taken into a debriefing room. The questions came fast and hard. What went wrong? Why did the helicopter fail? Could the collision have been prevented? Jim answered as best he could, but the truth was that nobody had a satisfying explanation. It was a combination of bad luck, aging equipment, impossible conditions, and the inherent risks of a mission that was too complex and too ambitious. The officials taking notes seemed frustrated, almost angry, as if they were looking for someone to blame. But there was no single villain in this story, just a lot of good men trying to do an impossible job. The news broke within hours. The American public woke up to reports of a failed military operation in Iran. The details were murky at first, but soon the full scope of the disaster became clear. 8 dead, helicopters abandoned in the desert, the mission a complete failure. President Carter addressed the nation, taking full responsibility, his face drawn and exhausted. The media tore into the administration. Critics called it a humiliation, and the families of the hostages were left with even less hope than before. America felt smaller somehow, less powerful, less confident. But here's the thing that most people don't know. The government made a decision in the aftermath of Operation Eagle Claw. They decided to bury it. Not completely, the broad strokes were public knowledge, but the specific details, the names of the men involved, the exact sequence of events and the lessons learned were all classified. The mission was officially acknowledged, but the depth of the failure and the heroism of the men who participated was hidden away in files that most Americans would never see. Jim Sullivan became a ghost, a man who had been part of one of the most significant military operations of the Cold War, but whose name appeared in no history books, no documentaries, no public records. If you're enjoying this story of sacrifice and hidden history, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We're dedicated to bringing you the forgotten stories of American heroes, the missions that shaped our nation but never made the headlines. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey. Jim returned home to Virginia, but he wasn't the same man who had left. His wife noticed it immediately. He was quieter, more distant, haunted by something he couldn't talk about. The official story was that he had been on a training exercise that had gone wrong. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't tell anyone. The weight of secrecy pressed down on him like a physical burden. He would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, the smell of burning fuel in his nostrils, the sound of the explosion echoing in his ears. His daughters asked him if he was okay, and he would force a smile and tell them he was just tired. Months passed, then years. The hostages were eventually released in January 1981, minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, a final humiliation for the Carter administration. The Iran hostage crisis faded from the front pages, replaced by new scandals, new wars, new crises. But for Jim, the mission never ended. He continued his military career, flying helicopters, training new pilots, serving his country with the same dedication he always had. But Operation Eagle Claw was always there, lurking in the background, a secret he carried alone. The worst part was watching the public narrative shift over time. Operation Eagle Claw became a punchline in some circles, a symbol of American weakness and incompetence. Late-night comedians made jokes about it. Political opponents used it as a weapon against Carter. Military analysts dissected it in classrooms, pointing out all the flaws in planning and execution. And through it all, Jim stayed silent. He couldn't defend the mission. He couldn't explain what it was really like to fly through that dust storm, to watch men die in the desert, to carry the weight of a failure that wasn't really his fault. The classification meant he was invisible, a participant in history who couldn't claim his place in it. In 1983, Jim was promoted to major and transferred to a base in Germany. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to leave the ghosts of Desert One behind. But the past has a way of following you. One evening, Jim was having a beer at the officers' club when another pilot sat down next to him. The man was younger, eager, full of the confidence that comes from not yet having seen things go truly wrong. He started talking about Operation Eagle Claw, repeating the conventional wisdom about poor planning and leadership failures. Jim listened, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the beer bottle a little too hard. Finally, the young pilot turned to him and asked what he thought about it. Jim could have told him everything. He could have explained what it was really like, the impossible conditions, the courage of the men involved, the thin line between success and failure. But he didn't. He just shrugged and said it was before his time, then finished his beer and left. Walking back to his quarters that night, Jim realized that the classification wasn't just protecting military secrets. It was protecting the reputation of people who didn't deserve protection, while silencing the men who had actually been there. It was a betrayal, subtle but profound, and it made him angrier than the mission failure ever had. The anger didn't consume him, though. Jim channeled it into his work, becoming one of the best helicopter instructors in the Army. He trained hundreds of pilots over the years, teaching them not just how to fly, but how to make decisions under pressure, how to bring their crew home, how to live with the weight of responsibility. He never mentioned Operation Eagle Claw directly, but the lessons from that night in the desert informed everything he taught. His students respected him, even if they didn't fully understand why he was so intense about certain procedures, why he drilled them so hard on emergency protocols, why he never let them take shortcuts. Jim retired from the Army in 1995 after more than 30 years of service. He settled back in Virginia in the same house where he had raised his daughters, now grown with families of their own. He tried to live a normal life. He mowed the lawn, went to church, attended grandkids' soccer games. But Operation Eagle Claw was still there, still classified, still a secret he couldn't share. He thought about writing it all down, leaving some kind of record for his family, but he worried about the legal implications. The classification hadn't been lifted. Technically, he could still face consequences for revealing details of the mission. Then, in 2000, something unexpected happened. The government began slowly declassifying documents related to Operation Eagle Claw. It was part of a broader effort to open up Cold War-era files for historical research. Jim started seeing articles and books that included details he recognized, information that had been forbidden for 2 decades. He read them with a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that the truth was finally coming out, frustration that it had taken so long, and that the narrative was still incomplete. The documents focused on the strategic failures, the political fallout, the impact on Carter's presidency. But they said very little about the men on the ground, the pilots who flew through impossible conditions, the soldiers who were ready to risk everything to save the hostages. Jim decided to break his silence. He reached out to a military historian who was writing a comprehensive account of the mission. At first, the historian was skeptical. There were a lot of people claiming to have been involved in Operation Eagle Claw, seeking attention or trying to settle scores. But Jim had documents, service records, and most importantly, details that only someone who had actually been there could know. They met at a diner in Virginia, and Jim told his story for the first time in 20 years. He talked about the training, the dust storm, the mechanical failures, the collision, and the fire. He talked about the men who died and the weight of carrying their memory in silence. The historian listened, taking notes, occasionally asking questions. When Jim finished, the historian looked at him and said, "This is the story that people need to hear." The book was published in 2002, and for the first time, Jim's name appeared in connection with Operation Eagle Claw. It wasn't a bestseller, but it reached the right people. Veterans who had been on the mission reached out to Jim, thanking him for finally telling the truth. Families of the men who died expressed gratitude for honoring their loved ones' sacrifice. And slowly, the public perception of Operation Eagle Claw began to shift. It was no longer just a story of failure and incompetence. It was a story of courage, of men who volunteered for an impossible mission knowing the risks, who did everything they could in the face of overwhelming odds. Jim started speaking at military events, sharing his experiences with new generations of soldiers. He didn't sugarcoat the failures or try to rewrite history. He was honest about what went wrong and why. But he also emphasized the professionalism and bravery of everyone involved. He wanted people to understand that failure doesn't diminish courage, that sometimes the mission fails despite everyone doing their job. It was a message that resonated deeply in a post-9/11 world, where soldiers were again being sent on dangerous missions with uncertain outcomes. In 2006, Jim attended a memorial service at Arlington National Cemetery for the 8 men who died at Desert One. It was a small, quiet ceremony, attended mostly by family members and a few Pentagon officials. Jim stood in the back, not wanting to intrude on the family's grief. But after the service, several family members approached him. They hugged him, thanked him for being there, for surviving, for keeping their loved one's memory alive. One woman, the widow of the pilot Jim had flown alongside, told him that she had spent decades not knowing the full story of how her husband died. Reading Jim's account had finally given her closure. It was one of the most emotional moments of Jim's life. Jim lived another decade, long enough to see Operation Eagle Claw become the subject of documentaries, academic studies, and even a museum exhibit at the Smithsonian. The mission was no longer hidden or forgotten. The men who participated were finally being recognized for their service and sacrifice. Jim gave his last interview in 2014, sitting in his living room surrounded by photos of his family and his military career. He was in his 70s then, his hair white, his hands shaking slightly from age. But his eyes were still sharp, his memory still clear. The interviewer asked him what he wanted people to remember about Operation Eagle Claw. Jim thought for a long moment before answering. He said he wanted people to understand that history is complicated, that failure and heroism can exist in the same story. He wanted people to know that the men who went to Desert One were the best America had, and they deserved to be honored, not mocked. And he wanted people to remember that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that never make the headlines, the ones that officially failed to exist but shaped the course of history anyway. Jim Sullivan passed away in 2016, surrounded by his family. His obituary mentioned his long military career, his service in Vietnam, and his love for his wife and daughters. It made a brief reference to his participation in a classified operation during the Carter administration, but gave no details. Most of the people who read it had no idea what that meant. They didn't know about the dust storm, the mechanical failures, the fire in the desert, or the 2 decades of silence that followed. They didn't know that Jim had been part of one of the most significant military operations in American history, a mission that officially failed to exist. But the veterans knew, the historians knew, the families of the men who died at Desert One knew, and in the years since Jim's death, his story has continued to spread. It's been included in military training programs as an example of how to handle failure with grace and dignity. It's been cited in debates about government secrecy and the importance of transparency. And it's become a reminder that there are countless American heroes whose names we'll never know, whose sacrifices remain hidden in classified files and faded memories. Jim's legacy isn't just about Operation Eagle Claw, though. It's about integrity, about speaking truth, even when it's difficult, about honoring your comrades even when the world has forgotten them. It's about the quiet courage of living with secrets and the even greater courage of finally sharing them when the time is right. Jim could have stayed silent for the rest of his life. He could have taken his story to the grave and let history remain incomplete. But he chose to speak, to add his voice to the record, to ensure that the men of Operation Eagle Claw would be remembered not as failures, but as heroes. Today, if you visit the Special Operations Memorial at Fort Liberty in North Carolina, you'll find a plaque listing the names of the 8 men who died at Desert One. Their names are etched in stone, permanent and public, no longer hidden by classification. And if you know where to look, in the archives of the Army Aviation Museum, you'll find Jim Sullivan's flight log from April 24, 1980. It's a simple document, just a record of times and locations and aircraft numbers. But it's also proof that he was there, that the mission happened, that the sacrifice was real. The story of Operation Eagle Claw teaches us something important about American history. We like our stories simple, with clear heroes and villains, with victories we can celebrate and defeats we can learn from. But the truth is usually messier than that. The truth is men like Jim Sullivan, who did everything right and still watched the mission fall apart. The truth is government officials who made impossible decisions with incomplete information. The truth is families who waited decades for answers that never fully came. And the truth is that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen in the missions that fail, in the moments when everything goes wrong, but people keep fighting anyway. Jim never considered himself a hero. In all his interviews and public appearances, he consistently deflected praise, insisting he was just doing his job, just following orders, just trying to bring his crew home. But that humility, that refusal to seek glory, is what made him heroic. He understood that being part of something bigger than yourself means accepting both the victories and the defeats, the recognition and the anonymity. He understood that sometimes your contribution to history is measured not in medals or promotions, but in the quiet knowledge that you showed up when it mattered, that you did your best, even when your best wasn't enough. The American heroes we celebrate are usually the ones who succeeded, who won the battles, who came home to ticker-tape parades and presidential commendations. But what about the ones who failed? What about the missions that went wrong, despite everyone's best efforts? What about the men and women who served in operations so classified that their families didn't even know what they were doing? These people exist in the shadows of history, their stories incomplete, their sacrifices often unrecognized. Jim Sullivan's story is a reminder that they matter too, that their courage counts, that failure in service of your country is still service. In the end, Operation Eagle Claw did more than just fail to rescue 52 hostages. It exposed weaknesses in American military capabilities that led to the creation of the Joint Special Operations Command, a reorganization that would prove crucial in future decades. It taught lessons about inter-service cooperation, equipment reliability, and operational planning that informed every major military operation that followed. The men who died at Desert One didn't die in vain, and the men like Jim who survived carried those lessons forward, making sure that future generations of soldiers would be better prepared, better equipped, and better led. That's the real legacy of the mission that officially failed to exist. Not the failure itself, but what we learned from it, and how we honored the men who were brave enough to try.